We are talking about the scandal in which Columbia dropped in their US News and World Report rankings and what that says about academia. So, for those of you who might not have heard, Columbia went from being around top 5, around number 5 in terms of best schools to go to out of the top 10. And US News and World Report said, hey, you had a professor at Columbia who did a bunch of research that says you've been messing with the numbers. What do we mean by messing with the numbers? We mean trying to hack the system by which US News and World Report ranks their schools, because they publish, hey, here's the rubric that we use to rank schools. So because everyone has the rubric, if you are a chancellor who is cautious about these rankings, you can mess with the rubric, or at least mess with what is reported to US News and World Report based on that rubric. And that is what it turned out they did. A professor went back, looked at all of the historical registry books that showed all the classes that were being offered. I'm struggling to remember the name of that book. I will Google it in a sec. But for the most part, we're talking about the list of all the classes being offered in a given semester or quarter, who's teaching that class, what's the name of that class, what's the number code of that class, and how many people can be let in it. That last part, how many people, is what's important. It turns out Columbia was reporting the wrong number of how many people were let in to make it look like they had a smaller class size. And their own professor exposed this. And so that's why they dropped in the rankings.
Haven't other colleges piggybacked off of them and decided to pull out of the rankings as well?
So to answer your question, yes, but Columbia didn't decide to pull out of the rankings. US News and World Report dropped them from the rankings. Difference. But some colleges have decided, hey, we're just not going to submit. I know Berkeley one year was like, we're just not going to report data to US News and World Report. Rankings are stupid. I'm not sure who else said we're not going to do it, but I do know that certain law schools have said, like, we're not going to give out grades. We're just going to give you like a pass fail, or we're just going to give you, good, very good, good, very good, or fail. That's a bit of a side issue because that doesn't have to do with rankings. But the other, what was the other thing about rankings? Yes. US News and World Report is the foremost place for ranking US institutions. There are other services that rank other institutions. US News and World Report's rankings are the most hackable because they publish their rubric. Why do I say hackable? US News and World Report also ranks MBA programs. Some notable schools had their MBA programs significantly drop, at least to them. Most notably, Dartmouth. They dropped out of the top 10.
Really?
Bloomberg does some rankings as well for MBA programs. The point is, Dartmouth was down bad. Dartmouth alumni contributed a shit ton of money, and because that's part of the rubric, how much your alumni give and how much you report, how well your alumni are doing in terms of who reports like the good paying jobs they have after going to your program and whatnot. The point is, Dartmouth put together a concerted effort to hack the rankings to improve their rankings because the rubric is published. So Dartmouth went from like 15 back to top 10 in like 2 years.
Fortune magazine reported last year that Harvard, Berkeley, and Yale have all pulled out of the US News and World Report on programs.
Wow. But they still accept, like, they still like being ranked. I think it's like, oh, look at us trying to be cool.
Yes, I think it's almost like a woke wave.
Right.
And they're riding on.
For Berkeley, this happens right after we had some interesting stuff with our ranking where we dropped below UCLA. So for the longest, Berkeley was at least one spot above UCLA.
Oh, yeah, always.
We get to the point where people were talking shit, which they shouldn't have been doing. But I remember someone who didn't even go to Cal at a fucking Cal game where we played UCLA talking shit like to UCLA people. Like, oh, we're sorry you didn't get into Cal. Nigga, you didn't get into Cal.
Right, you didn't get into Cal. Actually, 11 law schools, based on a report in InsideHigherEducation.com. According to their website, 11 law schools, with the most recent being the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Washington, have announced that they will also stay out of the rankings. The first law school to announce that it was dropping out was Yale University, which has been ranked the top law school in the U.S. news since it started the rankings more than 30 years ago. But in the last couple of weeks, Pennsylvania, Washington, Cornell, and the University of Chicago have announced that they would, in the last 2 weeks, two law schools at Cornell University and the University of Chicago announced that they would continue to participate with the rankings. University of Pennsylvania and University of Washington have opted out of the rankings, including Yale and Berkeley and Harvard. Harvard doesn't need it. I mean, people are going to go to Harvard no matter what.
Yeah, people are going to go there regardless. They've got their name, and then they feel like they've done enough virtue signaling to make up for, all the wealth they generated to help establish that name. Much of that wealth was built on slavery. Please go see.
Absolutely, it was. Check out our episode on the history of Harvard.
Yeah. Do you think this school just in the middle of Boston just naturally just got a endowment that's the largest endowment of any school in the world?
Mm-hmm.
No, the school itself is older than the country that it's in, and they've had their hands in every growth industry that this country has had going all the way back. So that's a little bit of context.
To your point, the New York Times wrote an article in November 2022, speaking to that, actually saying that colleges and universities have been criticizing the ranking system for decades, saying that it was unreliable and that it skewed schools who were trying to recruit students into public service and educational priorities, that sort of thing. But they had rarely taken action to thwart it, according to the New York Times article. And every year almost always submitted their data for judgment on their various undergraduate and graduate programs. However, Yale and Harvard law schools have announced that they will no longer cooperate. The law school deans excoriated U.S. News for using a methodology that they said devalued the efforts of schools like theirs that recruit poor working class students, provide financial aid based on need, and encourage students to go into low-paid public service after graduation.
That's all well and good. At the same time, a lot of people, if they're going to take on the crazy amount of debt that you have to take on to go to a school like Yale, they want to know that they're going to at least have the option of getting a high-paid job. Now, Yale already has a reputation, so people know you're going to have a Yale network. But let's replace Yale with X University. If you don't know anything about X University and you don't know that you have the chance to get a good-paying job, even if you want to go be a public defender at first coming out of X University Law School or whatever, if you want to know that you at least will have access to a cool network, that's important. But I do get where the deans are coming from. What say you?
Talk is cheap. And I don't really give a shit what these colleges or what anybody has to say at this point, from any school, any institution, any political party. And everybody seems to be talking out of both sides of their neck right now. And I find it deeply disappointing that our moral compass seems to be tipping more and more due south rather than due north. So until I hear Harvard speaking openly about how they plan on dealing with the ramifications of all that slave money that they're sitting on, all that real estate property that they're sitting on, and how they plan on making that right, it really doesn't matter whether or not these schools participate in rankings or invite more underprivileged kids to the schools. What we know is that nepotism is actually the primary way that people get into institutions of any kind, whether it's education or professionally. It starts with nepotism. It starts with who is your legacy? Who is your family line? If your family went to that school, you've got a 75% chance or higher chance of getting into that school. If they bought a building, donated funds, you're getting in.
Yeah.
So it really doesn't matter the rankings or that sort of thing. The schools that have legacies, the legacy schools like the Yales, the Princetons, the Harvards, they're going to remain legacy schools no matter what, the Stanfords, and people are going to go. And the people who are wealthy are going to be able to afford to go.
Yes.
That's why student debt forgiveness, I think, is so important.
Agree. 100% agree. And I did just want to add that this is all backed up by quantitative data. T is not talking out of her ass. There are plenty of studies that show that these very same schools that we are mentioning overwhelmingly let in legacies. So if anyone wants to complain about affirmative action or anything like that, the people that are getting the real affirmative action are legacies. If you want to say, oh, X amount of Black and brown people got in and their SAT scores are lower than one standard deviation, or their SAT scores were in the lowest 1/5 of all of the people who got in, and so therefore those people were going to classify as affirmative action, because that's what some people try to do. First of all, that doesn't take into consideration all the other things that those people, one, went through before they, ran their application. Okay. Because somebody could be, looking after 3 kids, mom's a crackhead, dad's in jail, and they managed to have a 4.1 GPA while being captain of a football team, president of the school,
Right. Or they could just be from a working poor family, meaning everybody's working full time, but they're still not making enough of a living wage to afford rent and housing in cities like San Francisco, California, Chicago, even at Atlanta and Florida now, which is outpricing everybody.
Yeah, which means they can't afford a tutor. So no private tutoring for their classes. And that means they can't afford to take the LSAT multiple times. They can't afford LSAT, or I said LSAT, SAT, and they can't afford a fancy SAT prep either.
Right.
Whereas there are kids from 2-parent households that are pulling in, north of $500,000 a year, sometimes north of, 7 figures. And they have a private tutor, they have a personal consultant on their application. And, we saw with Varsity Blues, they'll find a way of getting in by nature of just, oh, I'm on the sailing team, even though I never went to a sailing club practice or whatever. So this has been established, is the point.
Yeah. And those are just the ones we know about. Imagine the decades of the ones we don't.